By the time Calvin Brooks reached his front door, the street had already decided what he was now. The porch light was still on. He was certain he had turned it off that morning. That small detail should not have mattered, yet it stopped him cold. For a moment, he stood there with his keys in his hand, listening to the quiet hum of the neighborhood, trying to remember when his own home had last felt unfamiliar. He stepped inside and closed the door gently, as if any sudden sound might echo back out and invite something with it. The house smelled the same. Coffee from the morning, clean laundry, the faint citrus of floor polish. Everything was exactly where it should be, and yet nothing felt intact. Calvin set his jacket on the chair by the wall. He noticed a faint crease across the sleeve that had not been there before. He did not try to smooth it out. Instead, he stood in the hallway, breathing slowly, counting each breath the way he had learned to do years ago. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Keep the body calm. Let the mind catch up. Outside, a car passed. Its headlights swept briefly across the living room wall, and Calvin flinched before he could stop himself. For a split second, the light became something else. Red and blue bleeding through the window, a flash that did not belong to this house but had somehow found it anyway. He turned away from the window. The silence inside the house was heavier than it should have been. The clock on the kitchen wall ticked too loudly. The refrigerator hummed like it was trying to say something. Calvin poured himself a glass of water and drank it standing up, his back against the counter, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular. When he finally sat down, he chose the edge of the couch, not the middle, as if the center of the room were no longer safe. Through the front window, he could see the houses across the street. Curtains moved, not dramatically, just enough to notice. A shape behind fabric. A pause. Then stillness again. The same neighbors who had waved at him for years now watched without being seen, or thought they were unseen. Calvin understood that look. He had seen it before, just not directed at him. It was not anger. It was something quieter. Assessment. Recalculation. The subtle shift people made when they believed a story without hearing it out loud. Someone had already told it for them. His phone buzzed on the coffee table. He stared at it until the screen went dark again. No missed calls, no messages. Just a notification from earlier that he had not opened. A calendar reminder for a meeting that had already passed. A meeting he had never reached. He leaned back and closed his eyes. The memory did not arrive as images. It arrived as sensation. The pressure of a hand where it did not belong, the sound of his own name spoken like an accusation, the way the afternoon air had felt suddenly thin, like breathing required permission. Calvin opened his eyes again. On the entryway table, his briefcase sat where he had dropped it. The latch was crooked. Papers inside were folded wrong, corners bent, edges no longer aligned. He did not open it. He did not need to. He already knew what that disorder meant. Time interrupted, intention discarded, control taken and not returned. He had built his life on order, on being early, on being prepared, on being careful with words and gestures and tone, on believing that if he followed the rules closely enough, the rules would remember him. Tonight, that belief felt naive. A knock came at the door, not loud, not urgent, just firm enough to be heard. Calvin stood slowly. Every muscle in his body tightened without his permission. He walked to the door and looked through the peephole. Mrs. Pritchard stood on the porch, 70-something. Neat gray hair, cardigan buttoned all the way up despite the heat. She held her purse in both hands like she always did, posture straight, expression unreadable. Calvin opened the door. "I just wanted to make sure you got home," she said. Her voice was calm, almost gentle. Too gentle for the moment. "I did," Calvin replied. She nodded once. Her eyes moved past him, into the house, then back to his face. "I saw everything," she said. "Not just the lights. Everything." Calvin swallowed. "Thank you." Mrs. Pritchard hesitated, then lowered her voice. "You should know," she continued. "I saved it. More than once. And so did my sister in Ohio. And my son in Arizona." Calvin looked at her more closely now. "Saved what?" She met his gaze without blinking. "The truth," she said. For the first time since he had stepped inside his house, something shifted. Not relief, not hope, just awareness. A realization that what had happened did not belong only to this street, or this town, or even this day. Mrs. Pritchard gave a small nod, as if confirming a decision that had already been made. "Get some rest," she said. Tomorrow will be louder." She turned and walked back down the porch steps, her figure steady, unhurried. Calvin closed the door and leaned his forehead against it. Outside, the neighborhood settled back into its version of quiet. Inside, he stood alone in a house that still belonged to him, but no longer protected him. Something had been broken, not visibly, not all at once, but enough to leave a crack that would not stay contained. And somewhere beyond this street, beyond this town, that crack was already starting to echo. Calvin Brooks had built his life on small, disciplined routines. He woke up at the same time every morning, even on weekends, not because he had to, but because order made the day feel manageable. He ironed his shirts carefully, creasing the sleeves just enough to look professional without seeming rigid. He tied his shoes the same way each time, double knot, neat and reliable. These habits were not vanity, they were armor. By the time he stepped out of his house, he already looked like someone the world should trust. Calvin was 48, old enough to have learned patience, young enough to still believe effort mattered. For nearly 2 decades, his work had revolved around people most systems forgot once they aged out of sympathy. Teenagers with records, boys who had learned anger before grammar, kids who had been told early that the rules were not written with them in mind. At the community center, they called him Mr. Brooks, not because he demanded it, but because he carried himself like someone who deserved respect. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, he chose his words carefully, like they might be repeated later and need to hold up. "Stay calm," he would tell the boys during heated moments. "Say what happened, not how you feel about it. Systems respond to facts." It was advice he believed in deeply, not blindly, but enough. Calvin had never seen himself as naive. He understood the flaws. He read the headlines. He had attended the workshops, the panels, the diversity trainings, where uncomfortable truths were acknowledged and then neatly packaged. But he also believed something else, that if you met the system halfway, if you followed procedure, if you remained respectful under pressure, you gave yourself a fighting chance. That belief had carried him far. It had kept him employed. It had earned him plaques, handshakes, polite letters of recognition from offices that used careful language. It had kept him safe, or so he thought. On the morning everything changed, he dressed the way he always did when he had meetings that mattered. A brown overcoat pressed, a white shirt, a blue tie that signaled seriousness without arrogance. He checked the folder in his hand twice, confirming the papers were in the correct order. Signatures needed by noon. A small grant that would keep a mentorship program alive another year. He stepped outside, inhaling the crisp air, letting it settle his nerves. The neighborhood was quiet in that curated way, suburbs perfected, lawns trimmed evenly, flags hanging at respectful angles. A few parents loading kids into cars, coffee mugs in hand. Calvin nodded to Mrs. Henson across the street. She paused before nodding back. Just a second too long. He told himself not to overthink it. As he walked down his driveway, he noticed a patrol car at the corner. It was idling, not parked. The engine hummed low. The officer inside did not look at him directly, just enough to notice. Calvin kept walking. This was not new. Police cruisers rolled through the neighborhood regularly. Community presence, they called it. Visibility. Deterrence. Calvin had never objected to that. He believed in it, even. Order created safety. Structure prevented chaos. Still, the car did not move on. It followed at a slow crawl, tires barely making noise against the pavement. Not pulling up, not passing. Just there. Calvin felt a familiar tightening in his chest, not panic. Recognition. He adjusted his pace slightly, making sure it stayed even. He resisted the urge to check his phone. He kept his hands visible. These were habits too. Learned over time, taught quietly, passed down without ceremony. Just be normal, he whispered to himself. You have nothing to hide. The car accelerated suddenly, then slowed again. As if correcting itself, Calvin's mind began to run through possibilities the way it always did in moments like this. Routine stop, wrong address, someone matching a vague description. None of it had anything to do with him, and yet all of it could. He reminded himself of the truth. He lived here. He was dressed professionally. He was on his way to an appointment. The folder in his hand contained proof of purpose. Purpose mattered. That was the illusion he clung to. That context would protect him. That presentation would buy him time. That calm would be recognized as cooperation, not guilt. As he reached the sidewalk, he felt eyes on him again. Curtains shifted. A door closed softly. Somewhere behind him, the patrol car's engine revved. Calvin stopped walking. He stood still, shoulders relaxed, breathing measured. He turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge the presence behind him without appearing confrontational. This was the moment he feared most. Not the possibility of violence, not even the possibility of arrest. The fear was simpler, colder, that in a matter of seconds, he could become something he was not. A threat, a suspect, a story told without his voice. He had spent his entire adult life trying to stay ahead of that moment, believing that good behavior, documented service, and steady compliance could outpace prejudice. As the patrol car's door opened behind him, Calvin still believed that if he did everything right, the system would respond in kind. For just a few more seconds, that belief felt solid enough to stand on. And that was what made what came next so devastating. The first command came fast. "Stop! Don't move!" Calvin froze where he stood, one foot slightly ahead of the other, the folder tucked neatly under his arm. He did not turn around. He had learned long ago that sudden movements invited interpretation. Instead, he let his shoulders drop and kept his hands visible, fingers relaxed. "Yes, sir," he said calmly, his voice steady on purpose. A second voice cut in immediately, louder and sharper. "Hands up! Now!" Calvin hesitated for half a breath, not because he refused, but because his hands were already visible and holding paperwork. He raised them slowly anyway, letting the folder slip against his forearm. "I'm complying," he said. "Please let me know what you need me to do." The pause that followed was brief, but heavy. He could feel it stretching, thickening the air around him. "Drop what you're holding." "Don't drop anything. Keep your hands where I can see them." The commands overlapped, collided. Calvin's heart began to pound, not wildly, but insistently. This was the space where mistakes happened, not because someone resisted, but because clarity disappeared. "Officer," he said carefully, "I'm trying to follow your instructions." "Turn around." "No, stay right there." Calvin swallowed. His mouth had gone dry. He chose stillness. Silence, he believed, was safer than guessing wrong. The footsteps behind him shifted. He sensed movement close enough to feel, though nothing touched him yet. His breathing shortened despite his effort to control it. In through the nose, out through the mouth. He counted silently. This was the choice. He did not know it yet, but this was it. Speak up and risk being labeled argumentative. Stay quiet and hope compliance would be recognized. Calvin chose quiet. "I'm not a threat," he added softly, almost to himself. "I live here." "Stop talking." The words were not shouted, but they carried weight. Authority without volume, a warning disguised as instruction. Calvin nodded even though no one could see it. He stared straight ahead at the sidewalk, at a crack in the concrete that looked like a thin lightning bolt. He focused on that line as if it could anchor him. A hand brushed his elbow. Not forceful, not gentle either, just present. His muscles tensed instinctively, then relaxed. He forced them to relax. "Hands higher," someone said. Calvin raised them another inch. His shoulders burned faintly. The folder slipped completely and hit the ground behind him. Paper whispered against concrete. He resisted the urge to look back. "Don't turn around." "I won't," he replied. Time stretched in strange ways. Seconds felt long enough to examine. Calvin noticed details he would never remember later. The sound of a distant lawnmower, a dog barking once, then stopping, the smell of asphalt warming under the sun. He realized then that this moment was no longer about explaining. It was about enduring. A grip closed around his wrist, firmer now, not painful. Yet. Calvin inhaled sharply, then steadied himself. He did not pull away. He did not flinch. "I'm cooperating," he said again, his voice quieter this time. "Stop resisting." The word landed wrong. It echoed in his chest, disorienting, resisting what he had not moved. "I'm not resisting," he said, unable to keep the confusion out of his tone. "Don't argue." That was the twist. The moment he understood something was off. This was not about what he was doing. It was about how it would be described. Calvin felt another hand at his shoulder, guiding him slightly forward, not pushing, just directing. He followed the pressure instinctively, adjusting his stance to keep balance. In his mind, a single thought repeated, "Do exactly what they say. This will pass." He believed it because he needed to. Because his entire adult life had been built on the idea that cooperation shortened conflict, that patience disarmed tension, that calm invited reason. He did not know yet that the story being written around him had already chosen its ending. All he knew was that he had made his choice, and the consequences were already forming. Quietly, just out of sight, the pressure increased without warning. Not suddenly enough to justify alarm, but steadily, deliberately, as if testing how much space Calvin would give before someone decided he had given too little. Step back. Calvin shifted his weight carefully, moving 1 foot an inch behind the other. No, not like that. Stay where you are. He stopped immediately. His pulse was loud in his ears now, not frantic, but heavy. Each beat felt like it took effort. He became acutely aware of his breathing, of how shallow it had grown despite his attempts to slow it down. "I'm doing exactly what you're asking," he said, choosing each word with care. "Please just tell me one thing at a time." For a moment, no one answered. That silence was worse than shouting. It left space for interpretation, for imagination, for authority to decide what it wanted to hear. A grip tightened around his arm, firmer now, fingers pressing just enough to remind him he was not in control of the situation anymore. "Hands behind your back." Calvin hesitated, just a fraction of a second, not because he refused, but because his mind raced ahead, trying to calculate balance. His hands were already raised. Moving them behind him meant shifting his center of gravity. It meant trust. He made the movement slowly, deliberately, narrating it in his head as if that might help. Hands coming down, elbows bending, fingers interlacing behind him. "I'm complying," he said again. The air felt thicker now, like it resisted movement, like time itself had decided to slow down and watch. "Don't tense up." "I'm not," Calvin replied, though his muscles betrayed him. His body reacted faster than his intentions. The human instinct to protect joints, to stay upright. Another voice cut in, sharper than the first. "He's not listening." "That's not true," Calvin said, the edge of fear creeping into his voice despite his effort to contain it. "I'm doing everything you're saying." "Stop talking." The grip on his arm shifted higher. His shoulder protested, a dull ache blooming where pressure met bone. Calvin sucked in a breath before he could stop himself. That breath was enough. "There," someone said. "That's resistance." Calvin's heart dropped. "No," he said quickly. "That was just me breathing. I'm not resisting anything." The word hung between them now. Resisting. It felt surreal hearing it attached to him, like being called by the wrong name in a crowded room and realizing people were starting to look anyway. His sense of time fractured, seconds stretched into something elastic and unreliable. He could not tell how long he stood there, suspended between stillness and compliance, waiting for the moment when this would finally be acknowledged as enough. "Relax. Your arms." "I'm relaxed," he said, though his voice wavered. "You're stiffening." "I'm just trying to stand," Calvin replied, the strain creeping in despite himself. "Please." The hand on his shoulder pressed him forward slightly, just enough to force him to adjust again. His foot scraped against the pavement. A small sound. Insignificant. "Stop resisting," the voice repeated, louder now. Calvin felt something inside him crack, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet internal realization settling into place. This was no longer about what he did next. It was about how his body reacted to being controlled, about involuntary tension, about breathing, about balance, about things no policy manual ever accounted for. He closed his eyes briefly, a reflex he immediately regretted. Eyes open. He opened them at once. "I'm sorry," he said without thinking, not because he believed he was wrong, but because apology felt like another form of compliance, another way to de-escalate. That was the moment he crossed the line he never intended to, not by fighting back, not by raising his voice, but by believing that surrendering every ounce of himself would end the situation. The pressure on his arms increased again. His breathing grew shallow. The world narrowed to sensation. Grip. Heat. The sound of his own heartbeat thudding too fast. Somewhere behind him, papers shifted on the ground as a breeze picked up. Calvin stood there, silent now, giving them everything he thought they wanted, and in doing so, he unknowingly gave them the one thing that could not be taken back, the ability to tell the story without him. By the next morning, the story had already outrun the truth. Calvin knew it before anyone said a word to him. He felt it in the way the street sounded different. Not louder, quieter, like a room where a conversation stopped the moment someone walked in. When he stepped outside to get his mail, 2 doors down clicked shut almost immediately. Across the street, a woman who used to ask him about her grandson's grades pretended to be busy with her phone. A man walking his dog slowed just long enough to look, then crossed to the other side without meeting Calvin's eyes. Nothing had been said out loud, but everything had been communicated. Someone had talked, someone had posted, someone had framed the moment before Calvin ever had the chance to explain it. His phone confirmed it an hour later. A text from a colleague came first, short, careful. "Hey man, just checking in. Heard something strange. Hope you're okay." Then another. "Call me when you can. HR has questions." By lunchtime, the questions stopped sounding like concern and started sounding like procedure. Calvin sat at his kitchen table with his laptop open, reading an incident summary he did not recognize as his own life. The language was clinical, precise, cold. Subject appeared agitated. Subject failed to comply promptly. Subject exhibited behaviors consistent with resistance. There was no space in the report for hesitation, no acknowledgement of conflicting commands, no mention of stillness, no room for the human body reacting to pressure, just conclusions. It struck him then how final words could feel when written by someone else. At the community center, the shift was immediate, not overt, not hostile, just cautious. The front desk receptionist smiled the same way she always had, but her eyes lingered on him longer than usual. Conversations paused when he entered a room. A staff meeting was rescheduled without explanation. A mentoring session was quietly reassigned. Later that afternoon, his supervisor called. "Calvin," she said, her voice rehearsed. "This is just temporary, until things clear up." "I understand," he replied, even though he did not. "Not fully. We have to protect the organization," she continued. "You know how it is." He did know. He had taught kids that exact sentence as a warning. Institutions protected themselves first. People came later, if at all. When he hung up, the house felt smaller. That evening, he noticed a phone pointed in his direction as he walked to his car. A teenager pretending to text. A woman across the street holding her device just a little too steady. Calvin did not react. He had learned better than that. Reaction fed narratives. Still, each unseen lens felt like a quiet theft. Another piece of his life taken without permission. At dinner, his sister called from 2 states away. "Are you okay?" she asked, skipping pleasantries. "I am," he said. "Physically." She exhaled. "I saw something online. It didn't make sense." "It doesn't," Calvin replied. There was a pause. "What do you need?" she asked finally. Calvin looked around his kitchen, the magnets on the fridge, the calendar still marked with plans that now felt uncertain. "I don't know yet," he admitted. After the call, he sat alone in the darkened living room, watching headlights pass through the window. Each car slowed slightly. Each driver glanced toward his house. He realized then that shame did not arrive as humiliation. It arrived as doubt. Doubt planted quietly by repetition. If enough people looked at him like this, would he start to see himself differently? That was the real damage. Not the paperwork, not the suspension, not even the whispers. It was the understanding that the story now belonged to someone else, and no matter how carefully he had lived his life, he was no longer the one telling it. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Not certified, not urgent, just another envelope mixed in with utility bills and grocery flyers. Calvin almost missed it. The return address was familiar enough to make his stomach tighten before he even opened it. Administrative leave. Effective immediately. The words were careful, polished, legally precise. There was no accusation, no conclusion, no acknowledgement of the years he had given. Just distance. Just separation. A decision framed as neutrality. Calvin sat at the kitchen table holding the letter long after he finished reading it. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock. He folded the paper once, then again. Each crease felt deliberate, as if he were packaging part of himself away. By the end of the week, the pressure became arithmetic. Mortgage, insurance, utilities, student loan payments that never seemed to shrink no matter how responsibly he lived. He opened his banking app more often than he wanted to admit, watching numbers change slowly in the wrong direction. He had savings. He had always been careful. But even careful people bled eventually. Calls followed the same pattern. A polite voicemail asking him to confirm information. A second call clarifying procedure. A third reminding him of deadlines that seemed to exist only to be missed. Each interaction drained him in ways he could not explain. He filled out forms requesting clarification that led nowhere. He submitted statements that were acknowledged but never answered. He waited on hold long enough to memorize the automated voice's cadence. This is standard, they told him. Just process. Process had a way of erasing faces. Calvin learned quickly that nothing moved unless it was delayed. Every response arrived late enough to cause harm, but early enough to remain technically compliant. Requests were neither denied nor approved. They simply lingered. Silence became a tool. The community center stopped returning his emails. Friends hesitated before calling. Conversations ended with phrases like, "Let's see how this plays out," and "I'm sure it'll work itself out." Time did not work itself out. Time worked against him. One afternoon, he found himself sitting in his car outside the bank, forehead resting against the steering wheel. He had not planned to cry. It surprised him when it happened. The tears came quietly, almost politely, like his body did not want to inconvenience anyone. He wiped his face and laughed once, a sound without humor. This was how it worked. Not with force, but with erosion. The humiliation was not public anymore. It was administrative, hidden behind email signatures and recorded lines. No one raised their voice. No one threatened him outright. They simply waited. And in waiting, they drained him. That was when the understanding finally settled in. This was not about one officer, or one moment, or one misunderstanding on a quiet street. This was about a system that knew how to protect itself by exhausting the people it harmed, by making survival feel like resistance, by turning patience into a liability. Calvin straightened in his seat and started the engine. He was tired, deeply, bone tired, but he was still thinking clearly. And that, he realized, was the one thing they had not managed to take. Not yet. The truth did not arrive like a thunderclap. It came quietly, in pieces, delivered by people who had been watching longer than Calvin realized. Joan Pritchard was the first to sit across from him and say it out loud. "They changed it," she said, sliding a folder across his kitchen table. Her voice was calm, almost academic, but her eyes were sharp. Not the outcome, the wording, the timing, the parts that matter. Calvin opened the folder slowly. Inside were printed reports side by side, one version stamped and signed, another pulled from a public records request Joan had filed under her sister's name in another county. The differences were subtle. A sentence added, a verb adjusted, compliance softened into hesitation, hesitation hardened into resistance. "They didn't lie outright," Calvin said quietly. "No," Joan replied. "They did something worse. They curated." The word settled heavily in the room. Over the next few days, the pattern revealed itself. Body camera footage that should have been logged was marked unavailable. A technical error, they said. An upload failure. Routine data loss. Except the timestamps did not align. A public defender friend Joan trusted confirmed it. The camera had been docked. The file had existed. And then it hadn't. Calvin felt a cold clarity wash over him. "So this was never about what happened," he said. Joan shook her head. "It was about what could be proven." The lawyer came next. Renee Alvarez, civil rights, mid-40s, direct, no wasted language. She didn't ask Calvin how he felt. She asked what he remembered, in order, without interpretation. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair. "They're not reacting," she said. "They're managing." She explained it carefully. How internal reports moved through hands that knew which phrases triggered review and which buried complaints. How missing footage created plausible deniability. How delay itself became a defense. "And the silence," Calvin said. Renee nodded. "That's intentional. Silence pressures people to fill gaps with compliance." The realization hurt more than the arrest itself. Calvin had believed restraint was protection, that dignity was a shield, that if he stayed quiet long enough, reason would surface. Instead, silence had been interpreted as consent. The call from Washington came 2 days later. Not the White House, not yet. A liaison's office, federal oversight, calm voice, no promises. "We're reviewing a pattern," the man said. "Your case is not isolated." That was the moment the floor shifted. Calvin understood then that what he was facing was larger than personal injustice. larger than a department, larger even than the city. This was structural. Joan watched his face change as the pieces locked together. "They didn't expect you to connect the dots," she said. "They expected me to wait," Calvin replied. He looked down at the papers again, at the edits, the omissions, the fingerprints no one thought he would recognize. For the first time since it began, his anger had direction. The lesson was simple and brutal. Silence does not protect the innocent. It protects the system that needs them quiet. That night, Calvin stood at his window and watched the street the way it had watched him. The patrol car still passed. The neighbors still glanced away. But somewhere beyond this neighborhood, beyond these routines and rehearsed narratives, attention had shifted. The local doors were closing, and somewhere higher up, someone had started listening. The consequences did not arrive with sirens or raised voices. They arrived in conference rooms with closed doors, in carefully worded emails marked confidential, in meetings where chairs were suddenly reassigned and names were no longer spoken with confidence. Calvin learned about the first suspension from a local news alert on his phone. An officer placed on administrative leave pending review. No photo, no details, just enough information to signal a shift. By the end of the week, there were more. Internal affairs inquiries, external audits. A statement from the department that said very little while admitting more than it intended. Phrases like procedural irregularities and documentation discrepancies began to circulate. The people who had once spoken with certainty now spoke cautiously. Calvin noticed it most clearly the day he was asked to come downtown, not as a suspect, but as a witness. The building was the same. The lobby smelled the same, but the energy had changed. A man who once avoided eye contact now stood when Calvin entered the room. Another offered coffee without being asked. Their questions were polite, precise, defensive in ways they did not yet recognize. At one point, a supervisor cleared his throat and said, "We're just trying to understand how this escalated." Calvin almost smiled. "You were there," he replied evenly. "You already know." No one disagreed. The officer who had given the loudest commands was no longer present. His name appeared only in files now, followed by a language that distanced the institution from his choices. The one who had written the report avoided public spaces altogether, according to Joan, who still noticed everything. "They're learning," she said quietly. Too late, but learning. The department chief resigned on a Friday afternoon. Not forced, officially. Framed as a personal decision, a desire to spend more time with family. The press release thanked him for his years of service. Calvin read it once, then closed the browser. There was no satisfaction in it. At the state level, a review board opened cases that had been dormant for years. Complaints once dismissed as unfounded were reconsidered under new light. Patterns emerged. Familiar names repeated. The irony was not lost on Calvin. The system had tried to exhaust him into silence. Instead, it had exposed itself to scrutiny it could not outrun. One afternoon, as he walked past City Hall, he saw a man standing on the steps with papers in his hands, surrounded by microphones. A former supervisor, someone who had once nodded approvingly while others spoke for him. Now he was explaining. Calvin slowed just enough to listen. "We followed procedure," the man insisted. "We trusted the information we had." Calvin kept walking. He did not need to hear the rest. When his job was formally reinstated, the email was brief. No apology, no acknowledgement of harm, just confirmation. Calvin accepted it without comment. People congratulated him, told him he had won, that justice had prevailed. He did not correct them, but he did not agree either. Winning implied celebration. This felt more like standing still while everything else shifted around him. He had not gained anything. He had simply not been erased. That, he understood now, was the final price. The loss of certainty. The exposure of authority as something fragile. The realization that power rarely collapses dramatically. It retreats quietly, leaving damage behind. As Calvin drove home that evening, he passed the same intersection where it had all begun. The light turned red. He stopped. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the light changed, and he moved forward. Not victorious, not defeated, just upright. And behind him, the system that had tried to crush him continued adjusting to the weight of what it had revealed. The price had been paid, but no one felt whole. Calvin Brooks returned to his routines the way people return to a place after a storm, slowly. carefully, aware that what still stood was not the same as what had been there before. He woke up early again, ironed his shirts, tied his shoes with the same practiced motions. From the outside, nothing about his life appeared changed. He went back to work. He nodded to neighbors. He smiled when spoken to. But the calm he carried now was different. It was no longer built on trust. It was built on clarity. At the community center, the kids noticed it first. "You seem quieter," one of them said after a session. Not accusing, just observant. "I listen more now," Calvin replied. That was true. He listened to what people said and to what they avoided saying. He paid attention to pauses, to word choices, to who was protected by silence and who was not. He no longer believed that dignity alone could shield a person from harm, but he also did not abandon it. He understood its real purpose now. Dignity was not armor, it was evidence. Calvin never gave speeches about what happened. He never named names in public. He did not demand apologies or retribution. When asked, he spoke plainly, without embellishment, without bitterness. "I survived a system that works better when no one looks too closely," he would say. Then people looked. That was enough. Sometimes in the evenings, he sat on his porch and watched the streets settle into quiet. Cars passed. Lights flickered on and off in windows. Life resumed its careful rhythm. The patrol car still drove by. Less often now. Slower. The officer inside never lingered. Calvin felt no satisfaction in that. What stayed with him was something heavier. The knowledge that none of it had been inevitable. That the damage had come not from a single moment of force, but from countless small decisions made by people who believed their authority would never be questioned. He understood now that justice did not arrive to punish. It arrived to reveal, to show who people became when power went unchallenged, to expose what institutions valued when pressed, to make visible the quiet choices that shaped lives far beyond their original intent. What had happened to him did not stay local. It moved upward through reports and reviews and resignations, through offices that had never known his street or his name until it became unavoidable, through systems that preferred quiet resolution but were forced into accountability. And even now, long after the headlines faded, the echo remained, in conversations that stopped too suddenly, in policies rewritten without acknowledgement, in the careful way people chose their words when authority entered the room. Calvin stood one evening in front of his hallway mirror, adjusting his tie before hanging it neatly in the closet. He studied his reflection for a moment longer than necessary. He looked the same, but he knew better. Some abuses of power begin small, routine, local, almost invisible, but their echoes do not ask permission. They travel. They accumulate. They reach places their architects never intended. And in the quiet that follows, the real question is never what happened. It is who we became when it did. Calvin turned off the light and walked into the next room, leaving the mirror dark behind him. The street outside was calm. The echo remained. The story did not end with applause. There was no moment where Calvin Brooks stood at the center of a crowd and felt redeemed by noise. No grand victory speech, no swelling music to signal that everything had been restored. Instead, the ending arrived the way most real endings do, quietly, gradually, almost invisibly. Weeks passed, then months. Calvin returned fully to his work, but the work no longer felt the same, not heavier, just clearer. He noticed how often systems relied on people staying tired, how easily procedures could become weapons when no one asked why they existed, how many good people mistook silence for peace. He adjusted how he mentored the young men at the center. He no longer told them that doing everything right would guarantee safety. That had been a comforting lie, even when well-intentioned. Instead, he taught them something harder and more honest. "Learn the rules," he said, "but don't worship them. And never assume silence means fairness." They listened differently now. So did he. Some nights, Calvin still replayed moments in his mind. Not the fear, not the commands, but the choices. The small pauses where he had trusted a system that did not see him as fully human. The moments where he believed restraint would be recognized as innocence. Those memories no longer haunted him. They instructed him. He learned that justice was not a destination. It was a pressure. something that only moved when applied consistently from many directions by people willing to stay present long after the cameras left. The neighborhood eventually relaxed. New routines replaced old suspicions. A few neighbors apologized awkwardly. Others never mentioned it at all. Calvin did not push either way. He understood now that accountability could not be forced into hearts that had not chosen it. What mattered was what remained. Policies changed quietly. Oversight committees gained authority they had lacked before. Training manuals were revised, language adjusted, procedures tightened. None of it dramatic enough to trend online. All of it significant enough to alter future outcomes. Calvin knew this because people he had never met began reaching out. Emails, letters, short messages from other towns, other states. This happened to me too. I thought I was alone. I didn't know where to start. He answered when he could. Sometimes with advice, sometimes with nothing more than confirmation. You're not imagining it, you're not wrong, and you're not invisible. That, he realized, was the real ending. Not his vindication, but the shift he could not see at first. The way one small act of documentation, one refusal to disappear, had created space for others to speak. Power rarely expects echoes, it expects isolation, fatigue, compliance. What it does not anticipate is memory, or witnesses, or people who decide that silence is no longer safer than truth. Calvin stood one evening on his porch as the sun dipped low, the sky painted in muted oranges and grays, the same street, the same houses, the same quiet. But beneath it all, something irreversible had changed. Some abuses of power do not stay local. They travel upward through systems that once felt untouchable. They expose the scaffolding holding authority in place. They force institutions to confront not what they claim to stand for, but what they have tolerated. And long after the headlines fade, long after the files are archived, the echo remains in how carefully a command is given, in how documentation is preserved, in how someone chooses to speak instead of disappear. Calvin turned back inside, closing the door behind him. The night was calm, but the lesson endured, because justice does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives as a question that refuses to go away. And sometimes the most lasting consequence is not punishment at all, but the truth finally heard, changing who we are willing to be.